We know that when we get people right, we get business right. So I'd like to welcome you back to my podcast, but this time it's a bit different. I'm trading places. I got to sit in the guest hot seat to talk about some of the areas that I specialise in: leadership, performance and culture. I talk with the hosts of this episode about our collective experiences and expertise, providing thought-provoking insights around putting the human factor back into business. So today, I'm your guest, Lisa, psychologist, psychotherapist, and founder of It's Time for Change. And as you'll gather from this podcast, I thrive on conversations that make a difference. So reach out to me. As usual, my details are in the show notes, along with the resources. So grab a cuppa, sit back, and enjoy.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener.
And with me, Gareth, Tennant.
And this week we have two of our favourite things, three technically. The first one is we have a guest. The second one was we're outside. And the third I was going to say is we're in a pub car park where you'll hear cars going past us every now and then. I'm not sure that third one is really true. But Lisa Lloyd, we're very, very, very pleased to get you back on the podcast. How have you been and what have you been up to?
I have been very well, thank you. I have been busy working lots, doing travelling and catching up with very interesting people at all sorts of different events where I get to talk to super interesting people who just keep opening my mind to there's so much more to think about than what I've already been thinking about.
I've always wondered about people who do podcasts before we did one of our own, which is how do they find things to talk about every week? And to your point, every week is a new opportunity for a new idea or an old idea to sort of be turned on its head. So, What about you, Gareth? What have you been up to recently?
I've been working, doing lots of interesting things for my clients, looking at how they make better decisions and, as normal, make sense of large, complex organisations. But I've been mostly working in my garden this week in the sunshine. It's been lovely. But I do think we probably, for new listeners and for some of our regular listeners who may have forgotten, we probably need to actually explain who Lisa Lloyd is.
Well, rather than us do a terrible job, Lisa, why don't you give everyone a quick intro on some of the areas of specialism and why we've dragged you out here into, sounds very glamorous, a car park by a pub.
I was going to test you and get you to introduce me. Can I just say, we did start sitting in the garden. We were sitting in a nicer part. It was just a bit noisy. What do? I work with organisations around people, and it's about performance, culture and leadership. And the reason I think I'm here, not only to have a pint and chat with you lovely chaps, but is to kind of talk about what's going on in the world of work. And it's about actually taking the time to understand what's going on in workplaces and to unpick it so that we can then work out how to do things better. Because I think where we are at as a society at the moment is everything is very much information overload, and then people have too much information and they skim and they want quick fixes. And I'm about pressing pause and having good conversations. So being able to actually unpick and just stop and actually explore what's going on.
Well,
right.
So one of the reasons why actually this is a perfect time for a conversation is we all have busy lives, as we've just said, except me, who's actually spending a lot of time running, losing weight and walking my dog. That's a different conversation. We had planned to do this around Christmas. And the grand plan at Christmas would be a sort of review of leadership in 2025. That obviously miserably failed as we were all in different places doing different things. And so I was having a think about what we might talk about, what might be interesting. And one thing that you didn't touch on that we definitely touched on in our last conversation with you, Lisa, was psychological safety and things like that. I think we might argue some people would say some of the softer aspects of leadership. And again, just to reiterate for those who are new, we absolutely believe in things like empathy, in things like psychological safety, in terms of DEI, all those kinds of things, not because we're big old tree huggy hippies, although there may be some element of that, but actually because if you do those things and if you do them effectively, it gives you a competitive advantage. So I don't know there's anything soft about it. It is about giving you the best chance of success. The reason why this conversation seemed interesting is I was reminded of Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, and he talked about the fact that the rules-based order of the world was over, and there should be no illusion about this, about a broader geopolitical world.
Talked about a rupture rather than an evolution.
Exactly.
Mm.
And what was fascinating about that as a 55-year-old is that I find that really difficult to get my head around, because all of my life, this rules-based order that's discussed, sort of the approach to democracy, alliances, all these things have seemed unbreakable, unchangeable, and they are the basis of truth. And so for Mark Carney to say, and I think he's right, that world has changed, that's a really, it's difficult to sometimes get your head around such a fundamental change. And so I was reflecting on this. Is there a risk that we miss other changes like this? And we talk about all aspects of leadership. Lisa, you've talked about the workplace. Are we, in fact, in the middle of one of those changes around leadership? So that's really kind of queuing us up for today. Here is, I think, the danger, and I want to give each of you a chance to sort of talk about whether you think I'm talking nonsense. And that is, I suspect we have similar views and values around leadership. Naturally, that's why we would come together and talk about these things. And so therefore, I think it is almost too easy for us to say, no, nothing has changed. It's all as it was. Ignore what's going on around us. That obviously is either temporary or an aberration. I think actually one of the challenges is to say, no, really, we need to start to challenge our own views. Has something changed? Have elements changed? Or in fact, do we still believe what we've started on? So I don't know, Lisa is the guest today. How do you think about this? How do you test ideas when it's almost uncomfortable to question things like this?
Oh, good question. I think the discomfort, we need to start by understanding when people feel uncomfortable what that's about, and whether that's about people's fear of questioning the rules, whether it's actually okay to question the rules or not. And that goes back to you talking about psychological safety. And I think the term psychological safety is quite often misunderstood. People see it as we've just got to be nice to each other. We don't want to challenge. We just have to have nice conversations and keep everyone happy. So when then people are stepping up and wanting to question the rules, are they seen to be the outliers and there's difficult people in the corner who need to be quietened? Or are they people who are questioning the rules and doing things differently? Are they in a position of power, which means they just get away with it and everyone's expected just to nod and agree? It goes back fundamentally to that sense of how are we allowed to communicate and think and question.
I'd like this one because normally when we talk about these things, they're sort of quite ethereal. We're talking about someone else changing. For me, this is a really good example of I don't want things to change.
Yeah.
And so I think fear is almost too strong a word, but I don't want to believe that the principles and values of leadership that are important to me personally have somehow changed. So it's really interesting we're talking about something that actually matters to each of us now.
Yeah.
When often we say, well, you should be willing to change. It turns out for me it's harder. What's your sort of spin on this?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there is a fundamental change in the international rules-based system, but I think we conflate that with the wider international system. And what I mean by that is the rules-based international system is a whole load of sort of conventions that have developed over time, largely sort of post-war conventions that are based around lots of nation states trusting each other. What hasn't changed is the wider system of trust mechanisms. So money, for example, is a trust mechanism. Money still works the same way. And the world at a macro level, state interactions, geopolitics, it has fundamentally changed. And I think Mark Carney's entirely right. Does that mean that the rules of leadership have changed? I think in the context of international state diplomacy, then potentially. When it comes to what makes good leaders, I don't think it has. And I think that there's two reasons for that. One, this idea that might makes right and all of the subtlety and complexity that we're perhaps used to in the international stage is going away, doesn't necessarily mean that the people who are throwing their weight around aren't necessarily achieving the long-term outcomes that they want. And I think we are seeing strongman politics that in some cases and from some perspectives is being quite effective. And you can judge leadership by outcomes, or you can judge it by intent. But I think over the long term, we're going to see some significant problems as a result of that. And if you look at, Vladimir Putin in Russia is a really, really good example, and perhaps currently the most strongman authoritarian leader that we have. Russia is on its knees. This is not good leadership. This is not good leadership in terms of taking Russia forward. It's not good for the people of Russia. It's not good for the international order. It's not good for basically anything other than potentially Vladimir Putin enriching himself and keeping himself in power. The other thing I would sort of talk about is that over the long term, actually, when rules break down, the thing that absolutely becomes imperative then is those soft power relationships. And I think that, whether we're talking about international politics or a small business or anything in between, leadership and the things that make teams effective hasn't really changed. I think the context of the game has potentially changed.
The whole purpose of this, I think, to some degree, is for us at the end of this to raise a glass to each other and say all the things we believe are true are true. But I really want to push us on those things because I think you could have a different set of people around this table that would roll their eyes and say, well, that's bloody typical of the left-wing tree huggers and the nonsense. Vladimir Putin, as an example you gave, is still in charge in Russia, as an example. I mean, This isn't about Vladimir Putin, but he is in charge.
Yeah.
His troops are occupying a significant part of a sovereign country. So we might say, well, of course, he's not winning and he's in a bad position. Well, others might argue that's not the case. So this is not to necessarily deny what you're saying, but I think it's incumbent upon us to be much better at saying why.
Yes,
and being really ruthless about, so why do we think that is better?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I think you've sort of touched on some of those things, but let's. I wrote down some specifically provocative questions that allow us to sort of tackle this a bit more. So, first question: are we witnessing a leadership revolution, a true revolution in leadership, or are we just seeing one of these cyclical swings back to where hard power and command and control work? And we see this today, certainly in the political world. We see nations, whether it be our friend Mr. Putin in the Ukraine and other countries around the world, where potentially might is now right. And we see people saying there are all sorts of, in inverted commas, old ways of being leaders, whether that's a country, whether that's an organization, or whether that's a business, and many of these being turned on their heads. Gareth, what do you think? Is this really a change in leadership, or is this local change or a short-term change, or are we really in a world where the leadership rules still work as they used to?
Yeah, so I think the fact that some people are applying a populist approach, and by that I mean, quite specifically, oversimplifying complex problems and applying a might is right and a broad brush, we're right, you're wrong, polarization and all of the things that come with populism, doesn't necessarily mean that the system has changed or that the things that make good leaders has changed. I think what we've seen, or what we are seeing, is bad leadership, bad leaders being put into positions of power and then being exposed. And I think it's quite risky in some respects to sort of extract lessons from geopolitics and then try and apply it broad brush to leadership more generally.
Well, you say that, and sorry, you are right in that, but unfortunately, I think geopolitical, we do look to our leaders to some degree. They set the tone in terms of what is acceptable and what the intention is. And so I agree it's not the same, but I think these things are linked. And I'll link it, and I'll come on to you in a second, Lisa, of what you're seeing, which is I see businesses, and there's a few tech businesses that we see where their leadership style is very, very different now. They very much are, I am right, everyone else is wrong, and I will use my power to exert authority. I think Palantir just recently came out with a manifesto, which is fascinating in terms of a commercial organization. Lisa, maybe bringing it to you. You work with businesses. Maybe we're self-selecting, so there's a bias in there. But do you see them either changing their leadership styles or their approach to leadership, or do you even see them almost questioning and reevaluating given what's going on around the world?
I think the latter. So I think people are, I think there's more of a debate around now about leadership because people are seeing, and you just said about, international figures setting the standard for what's good leadership. I think they set the standard for what they think is acceptable. And I think everyone else has their own view on it. And there's a lot of debate around that. And I think it's a good thing because that means people are really questioning, do we like that style of leadership? What works about that? What doesn't work about that? What are the problems about it? And everyone has a view now on leadership because they can't help but see it on the news every day. So people are much more aware of what they think good leadership looks and feels and sounds like, compared to in the past they might have been a bit more protective from it, a bit more unaware of it. I think it's just increased the debate.
Is that a sign because there's more stress and more tension and more worry and more fear? I always get the feeling that in terms of governments, I think about the UK government, when everything's going well, everyone has an opinion about the government, but everyone's generally kind of okay about things. When things start to go wrong, when taxes start to go up, when people lose their jobs, all of a sudden they become far more engaged. Do you think it's a representation that some people are worried about what this new world looks like, that to your point, all of a sudden now in a boardroom they're starting to talk about leadership in a way that maybe they wouldn't have done 4 or 5 years ago?
Yeah, I think, when people are under pressure and there's lots of questioning about the way of the world, and it suddenly feels it's impacting on everyone, not just, those people over there, it's starting to tap into people's nervous system as well. So it's not just about this is a black and white logical leadership issue. This is impacting on how people feel day to day. People are feeling more anxious about the state of the world and about their jobs and about, can I pay to drive? There are so many decisions being made by leaders that are impacting how we are showing up day to day. And they're seeing it in leaders, they're sensing the emotion and the kind of the impact of emotion, actually, just in terms of decision making, sort of jumping back and forth from one thing to another thing, and not being decisions that are made don't seem to be very well thought through because they seem to be very emotional. Yeah. And we're seeing, so people again are seeing that, they're sensing that, which has all sorts of repercussions for individuals, teams, leaders of organisations.
Yeah, I think part of that is survivability bias, though, in that we're talking about the leaders that are making short-term and emotional decisions. I think there is still plenty of good leadership that is just not on the front pages of
Yeah.
the newspapers or, in our social media feeds. And I think certainly if you look at, why are people leaders? So political leaders, certainly in democratic systems, but also slightly more broadly, are representing the interests of the nation, but are put in power based on popularity. And so there is a pressure on leaders in those situations or those positions where they have to be seen to be doing what people want them to do. Whereas a business leader has a different set of pressures. Business leaders are representing the interests of shareholders normally, and are making decisions around the long-term financial health of the organisation. Completely different again from military leaders. And I've been talking to some of my old military colleagues recently who are sort of caught between the two. So they're having to make decisions about where to invest in technological change. We're seeing huge changes within the concept and the character of warfare from lessons from Ukraine and various other conflicts. So they're making investment decisions for the long term at a time where political leaders, as Lisa said, are making quite short-term and quite rash decisions, and they're also having to think about the morale of their organisations, and they're having to navigate a really complex set of challenges, and are quietly getting on with it. And I think that's a really good example, albeit anecdotal, of where actually good traditional leadership traits are winning by holding organisations together, even though the people in those organisations are feeling perhaps more anxious than they were a couple of years ago.
So I wonder whether it's something about noise versus signal. We see people standing up and banging their fist on the table or saying, I'm in charge, listen to me. But the point is, good leadership goes on almost unnoticed by design. I was talking to my son. He's going to university. He's going to go and study politics. And I thought, I'm going to give him a head start. I'm going to give him the Chris Kitchener theory of all things politics. But I realized, as we were just talking, this theory of politics actually isn't a theory of politics. Maybe I'm going to christen it the new Chris Kitchener theory of leadership. And that is, to be truly successful, and I should define in a minute what I mean by truly, you need three things. The first thing is you need a mission. You need something you can communicate to people that they care about. We're going to the moon. We're going to eradicate poverty. We're going to lower your taxes. We're going to make cheaper fuel. Whatever it is, you have to be able to articulate a goal which seems difficult, but over a period of time, you can take steps together. That's number one. Number two, you need to have competent people who can then start to deliver on these things. Number three, and we'll get to sort of where you'll debate me in a minute, you need a charismatic person who can be at the head of this and can communicate these things, can communicate with people, can communicate the vision. And I think the reason why I sort of talked about this initially as my political theory is that I could point at a number of governments where they do some of these things well and other things they do very poorly, and ultimately that doesn't give them longevity. And populism is the perfect example of we're going to get those people who are holding you back. I'm going to make your taxes half of what they are today. They're great at the communication. They've got a mission that people can get behind, but then they lack the competency to actually be able to achieve that. And so therefore they fail. I wonder whether actually that's true also now for leadership. I think we've got people today who stand up and say, follow me, I'm the strong man, I can give you a vision, but they actually don't have the ability, that it doesn't stick almost.
I think it entirely depends what you're measuring to define good leadership. So if you take let's go with Vladimir Putin, because we've talked about him a couple of times already. Are we measuring Vladimir Putin's leadership on duration in office? because if we are, he's very successful. He has held on to power in an incredibly difficult and volatile situation over the last 20 odd years. Really successful. Are we measuring it on accumulation of power? Again, arguably,
Seems to have a
quite
bit of power.
successful. Although I would say actually Russia as a whole is starting to hemorrhage power now. So you could argue that there's
But have you made the point
pros
though,
and
that
cons.
this is a slippery eel measuring success? Because those first two ones,
I think you've got to define.
oh my God, one of the
Yeah.
most powerful people, one of the most successful leaders in the last 100 years.
Is it about legacy? Because I would argue Vladimir Putin, from a international standpoint, is going to go down in history as
Well,
infamous, but not.
Do we, as leaders,
Not
then,
celebrated.
do we get to decide what we want to be measured by? Because Vladimir Putin would say, I mean, probably quite quietly, I don't really care about legacy. When I'm dead, I'm dead. I just want to have all the money in
I'm
the
not
world.
sure. I'm not sure.
But
He is driven by this.
irrespective of whether he does or doesn't,
But
it does feel
Yeah.
like, and I think it comes to this core question we're asking of, is leadership changing? You could argue, I don't care about many of the things you've talked about in the past. We have talked about in the past, that my team is safe, healthy, and ends up better in the beginning. I don't care about that.
Yeah.
I am now a successful leader.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
I think your point is spot on about we have to know what we're measuring. And if you're a business leader, what would your shareholders, how they define success? Because that's going to be what motivates the leaders.
Yeah.
What would if you want employees to work in your business, what do they see as success measures, which might differ to the shareholders? Then you've got to work out how you're meeting different needs.
Yeah.
But you have to be clear about what success, how the success is defined. And if it isn't defined, it's left to the individual leader. That's where you get that individual character coming through, and not necessarily aligning with what's important for the broader purpose.
I think that's really, really well said. And I think we probably around this table, and most of our listeners would probably agree that actually the defining success criteria feels more in the right ballpark if we start talking about how the organisation is left, how the people in the organisation feel, whether it's achieving what the organisation is setting out to achieve. But that's not necessarily what everybody defines it as.
But I really like this idea of defining success, because I suspect you start to squeeze out some of these things that maybe are less desirable. If you said to a business, if you said to a board, tell me about what you mean is success for a business, there are many people that would assume it's revenue numbers.
Yeah.
Great. So I can be as ruthless as I want. I can have people who die along the way as long as we get the revenue numbers. Well, actually, that's not what a board would say. A board would say, actually, corporate value is what I want. And corporate value is described by multiple things. A headline is, of course, going to be revenue, but having a group of people who are happy to work in the organization and don't risk the organization. So I love the idea of nailing that down, because I think the kind of people that, to be honest, make me nervous get to be very narrow in their view of what success is, and therefore get to say, well, this empathy nonsense, it's got nothing to do with success I declare to be.
Yeah.
Success is whether I drive a fast car. I don't care about anyone else. Look, I'm driving a fast car. So that, I think, is fascinating, because you force people to talk about what they really value, and it turns out maybe it's a systemic set of values rather than one specific thing.
And then I think it creates space to have all the different styles of leadership, because you will have some leaders who are the kind of, it's all about power and being mighty. But if they are defining success and they feel confident that their success criteria, as agreed with the shareholders or the board, are, we are all about numbers, making as much money as we possibly can make at all costs, then employees can make an informed decision about whether to go and work in an organisation like that. So you choose the type of leader you want to work for, but you need almost to know what they are defining as success to understand how they're going to shape their practice, their culture.
Do you think businesses do that today? I have a particular view on this, because what you've almost said is there is an awful lot of assumption about what success looks like, and it's not necessarily called out. You might imagine that a CEO would stand up and say, here are 10 things which I care about over the next year. The number one is revenue, because guys, we have to grow. However, I want to have people who are passionate to work here, and that means only a certain number of people leave to go elsewhere. Do you think that happens? Where people are so explicit about these are the measures of success that I have?
Nowhere near enough. And whatever happens, whatever discussions that are happening in a boardroom are not being communicated elsewhere. So everyone has their own. You see it all the time with, leaders will have some idea. If leaders are aligned in what they think their measure of success is, and that's not always the case in terms of a leadership team, managers have their own interpretation of that. Individual employees have their own interpretation because it's not clearly communicated.
Yeah, I think there's another complexity as well, which is it's not necessarily just what the leader defines as success. It's also what the leader feels those who have influence over their position define as success. So if you're a political leader, that is the electorate, the voters, and that's why populism wins through so well, because it's the short-termist solutions that make potential voters happy. If you're a organisational leader in business, it's probably the voting members on the board and the voting shareholders and what they perceive as success, which might be slightly different from what you perceive as success. And it creates short or long-term incentives. And I think getting those in balance is quite important. And I see this quite often not in balance, and you end up with short-termism. How do I please people over the next quarter? I'll worry about next year later.
We should stop for a break in a second, but that strikes me as really interesting, that you might argue that for many of the people that we perceive to be leading differently, actually they've not talked about what success looks like. And if they had, maybe people would agree or disagree in a different way. That's fascinating. I can see that both on the boardroom, but I can see that at that large level.
I think it's more than just agree or disagree. I think it is a conversation. And you talked about one of your sort of defining success characteristics before I sort of made it complex by asking what you meant by success. And you talked about competence and charisma and communication. And I think part of it is communicating your values, your mission, and then convincing people. So if you are a political leader, it's about convincing the electorate that sometimes you're going to make decisions that aren't popular, that aren't the thing that they necessarily want in the short term, but it is for the long term, benefit of the whole. If you're a business leader, you might make some longer term decisions that are going to reduce your revenue over the next quarter, which, to a shareholder is bad news, but it's going to make the company stronger in the long term. And we can get really complex about, where we are currently with companies making decisions based on the political climate and taking shortcuts around things like climate change. They're rolling back quite a lot of progressive policies around diversity, equity and inclusion because they feel like the political climate means they can get away with it. I think time will tell, but I think that's quite short term.
Well, let's take a break now, but I want to pick up on that when we come back and probe this idea of, can you change your leadership values? Let's come back in a second and do that. Welcome back. Well, look, we're at a pub. And so rather than doing the thing which we normally do of saying we'll be right back, count to 5 and then come back again, actually Gareth did go away and get a pint and a half a litre as well. So forgive us if we are not as connected with the first half as we would have been. But I think what we were talking about was we are seeing businesses that are now, for arguably political reasons, changing some of their policies. And I think the example we've seen is in the States. I see more and more organizations that are dropping DEI policies. And my question
Well, I think some of it is for political reasons. I think some of it is also for business reasons, and they are using a change in the political climate to do those things. So it is cheaper to have less policy, generally. And so I think a lot of organisations are making business decisions rather than political decisions. Some are making political decisions because they think it's going to make them more popular. But I think it's a mix of the two.
Well,
but it is that relationship between politics and
let's break those down into the two things. I've been fascinated by organisations that had very strong brands, as it were, changing those brands. I think we've seen organisations doing things that we wouldn't have expected of them, Apple and a couple of others changing. And I'm kind of wondering, can they get away with it? Because the answer is, of course, they can get away with it because they're multi-billion-dollar corporations. But maybe this is just me feeling hard done by or bad about it. But that's really difficult for me to see an organisation that for many years declared these are our values, and then for one reason or another, then abandon them with great speed and alacrity. Can we forgive those organisations? I don't know. I don't even. Maybe I'm asking the wrong question because it's not about forgiving them. But that feels to me actually a big chipping away at their leadership identity, which says, "Oh, hang on a minute. This thing that you told us that was really important, the moment you felt you could get an advice somewhere else, it wasn't important. Maybe the thing here I'm trying to root around for this is." I'm now going to doubt anything you say.
It undermines the trust.
Is it transactional now all of a sudden?
Yeah, it feels very transactional. I think if you've got someone suddenly, you know how someone, an individual or, a leader or an organisation works, and suddenly they do a U-turn and show up differently, that really questions your trust in that organisation.
Does it matter? This goes back to the very original premise of this episode, which is leadership changing? And I think the three of us sitting here with our drinks in our hand would say this demonstrates a lapse in leadership. And exactly as you said, Lisa, this is the point I'm making. So does it matter?
I'm questioning this. This is a question of strategy, not leadership. So a business makes a pivotal change based on what it does or how it's going to enforce safety, or these are decisions based on the cost-benefit balance of what effect it's going to have on the things that they measure. So the bottom line, the risk that they're going to do harm, all of these things. When BP, about 15 years ago, decided that pretty quickly, in a matter of weeks, that it was going to invest heavily in renewables. I don't remember anybody saying this was a lack of leadership and it's undermining trust, because I always thought they were a fossil fuel company.
But interesting, they're going the other way now.
They're
going back towards the fossil fuel.
They are, but their mission is not to save the planet. Their mission is to be a company that makes money for the investors and job security for their employees. There is a wider question of whether society should allow them to do that or to what extent. But it's not a commercial business's job to fix climate change. That's a charity.
Is it a
job.
cop-out to say it's
job.
Strategy versus leadership? I'm being a little bit provocative here, but I kind of agree with you, but I also think it's a bit of a cop-out. Lisa, what do you reckon?
I think it's, if that change is happening for a valid... If it's been thought through and the change is happening because it needs to happen.
And communicated.
So is it that people are disliking the change? Because if an organisation is making a change, which actually is for the good, however we define that, people still might not like it because it's change.
Yeah.
That's not what I know this organisation for, or that's not what I'm used to experiencing. So is it they don't like the change per se, or is it they don't agree with why the change is happening? So it comes back to the why. Why is this set of values or this set of behaviours, expectations suddenly changing? Do I agree with the why? Because if I understand the reason something's happening, I still might not like it because it's not what I'm used to, but I can get used to that. And if the values don't align,
I completely agree. And I think as a business, if more of your customers, or if enough of your customers align with that change and carry on buying your products or services, then from a leadership point of view, it's probably the right thing to do. It's if you're only in business to make the world a better place, then you probably shouldn't be in business.
Yeah.
You should probably be in charity or government, because it's governments that have the responsibility to enforce the changes that make things like climate change, things like moving society forward.
See, not tree hugging hippies here at this table. I mean, it beautifully leads to this. By the way, believe it or not, that was the first question. Here's the second question, which is beautifully queued up. If outcomes improve under more ruthless, less people-centric leadership, does that invalidate modern leadership thinking? I would argue what we have just said is the role of an organization is to be successful. And therefore, if you need to be successful, ruthless is a very emotional word, but it does change what, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I go back to what I said. What are you measuring?
Yeah.
And the second question is over what timescale? So it might be that in 5 years' time, we realise that a lot of these businesses have overcorrected and done significant harm both to their trust relationships and their customer base. And it might, with the benefit of hindsight, we might say that some of the current leadership within large corporations was really bad. So again, I think it's context dependent. It's what are you measuring as success? But I think if you're a CEO of a company, your job is to steady the ship, but also make sure it's on the right course. And I think that's the balance. And like this sailing analogy that I seem to be going along with, if you don't have favourable winds, you might need to tack. And that means it doesn't feel like you're on the right course, but over the long term, you are heading in the right direction.
I think you are right, but it does make me feel more uncomfortable. And I don't know that we've talked about it quite in this way before over many, many episodes. The strategy almost trumps everything. And so therefore your leadership style and the outcomes and how you treat your teams and how you behave I'll go one step further, should vary to ensure that's true. That I think that's right, but it makes me feel very uncomfortable. And I'm using sort of the trolley car extreme. If I have to, I'm going to kill some of my people because that's what I have to do. Now, that's not true. You would never do that. But you are saying that strategy can at times trump what we maybe we're introducing a new word, moral leadership. Maybe is there a word real leadership, like realpolitik?
Well, I think going back to your three things, mission, competence and charisma, mission is what strategy is all about. It's accomplishing goals over the long term under conditions of uncertainty, balancing ends, ways and means. And so I don't think strategy trumps everything, but I think getting the balance of strategy, long-term thinking with tactics, using resources now to achieve things so that you steady the ship, so you don't go bankrupt in the next quarter.
You really do like this ship analogy, don't you?
It works. But you don't go bankrupt in the next quarter and you don't kill all your employees. But over the long term, you are growing as an organisation and you are making the change in the world that you set out to make. And I think it's that balance. So I don't think strategy trumps everything, but I think clear goals, clear mission and competent managing of those resources is how this all works.
And with the competence makes me think of accountability. So there's the whole, like, everyone's accountable to achieving whatever it is the organisation setting out. So this strategy, what is it we're trying to achieve, and how do we hold people accountable for? So as a leader, you should be held to account to achieve what it is that the organisation setting out. And your job, because you just use the word ruthless. Again, sometimes people fear. I've seen leaders worry about holding people to account because I seem a bit like I'm being a bit ruthless. It's like, that's your job to
Well, I mean,
have
yeah.
standards.
It's funny, isn't it? Ruthless is one of those words which is a very emotional, fuzzy word.
Yeah.
What do you mean ruthless? I have made people redundant. I have personally stood in front of people and said, I'm afraid you no longer have a job. Is that ruthless? I think
No.
that isn't
No,
ruthless.
that's necessary.
Is it, I don't really want to bother with this, so I'm just going to get rid of you. I don't know. But
Yeah.
this idea of maybe the statement is ruthlessness isn't a useful word, but clear action is important, but it needs to be supported by these other things. I want to go back to something that you said, and this is more to allow me to sleep at night, because I fear we've gone a little bit more towards if we have to burn all the boats and eat the dogs, that's absolutely fine, to use an Arctic explorer analogy, so we can all do analogies. I think one of the things you talked about, Gareth, was this element of time. In other words, I need to be able to make people redundant, but I also need to be able to do that in a way that allows the people who are remaining to trust me. In other words, if I behave as a poor leader, if I demonstrate toxic but ruthless, both bad words, behaviors that get me a short-term benefit, over the long term, I need to still balance those things out. If that's all I've got, if all I've got is might is right, and I'm in charge, and I'm going to punish you if you don't do what I say, that can lead to a short-term success, depending what your definition is. But long-term, you chip away, and it feels to me like leadership is a long-term game. It has to be a long-term game.
So it absolutely is, and you define timescales based on context. So in business, that is, years, if not decades. If it's a military operation, that long-term timescale could be days. So I think it's context dependent. But because this is a podcast where we compare and contrast military versus civilian views, I'm going to quote Sun Tzu. Which
Get in there.
So Sun Tzu.
Sorry, drink when he says that.
Sun Tzu, like thousands of years ago, said strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. And I feel like populism is just the noise before defeat. I think it's short-termism. It's promising people things that you can't deliver that over time will erode trust that is fundamental to long-term leadership. And as such, will leave organisations, whether that's countries or businesses, in a worse place than when you found them. It will leave the people that live or work in those organisations in a worse place than when you found them, and it won't achieve any long-term goals. I think it is the noise before defeat. I think the challenge is, because particularly with politics, it's convincing the people that put people into power that is the case.
Well,
and that's a really difficult thing to do.
It goes back to my now patented three things. You need a mission that people can get behind.
Yeah.
You need competence and a mechanism to be able to deliver those things, to prove you can do it. And you need the charisma to communicate it at all stages, what the mission is, that we're competent, that we're making progress. I think we asked the question earlier on, and I'm pretty sure I didn't allow you to properly answer. Lisa, are you seeing people talk about leadership differently at all? We've said that, and I do think it's true that there really is this sort of slightly different vibe in the world around leadership. Are you seeing that, or is it just people are questioning it?
What I'm seeing is that people are questioning it more and wanting to be clear about who they are as leaders. So they're seeing examples of leaders they don't want to be, which is then raising the question of what is the leader, what is the leadership style you, or who do you want to be as a leader?
So more so than they've done in the past. When you go to clients, they're much more.
Yeah,
Lisa, we brought you in because we want to know what kind of leaders we want to be.
Well, you know what? people often don't bring me in for that, but that's one of the first questions I ask them, a bit like going back to your defining success. And they're like, oh yeah, we never thought about that before. Now, whereas before I might have had to explain why that was important, now people get it much more quickly because they understand the need to think about how they are as leaders. So going back to the point we were just talking about around time and how the speed of things, speed has often been seen as a real strength. So if we do things quickly, we are seen to be successful. And I will suggest that maybe we need to slow things down a little bit so we can have the conversations about what success looks
Lisa,
like.
I think you'll find we have to run fast and break things.
Yeah.
I think you'll find.
But so I think people are much more, they get now much more quickly why these conversations are important and are much more willing to find the time and space to have the conversations that previously they wouldn't have bothered having because leadership's really obvious. We just need to crack on and get the job done.
I think you've hit on something really important where this idea that this is so important, we're in a hurry. I hear this today about AI. When you look at the different AI companies, whether this is true or not, I don't know, but most of the AI company leaders hate each other. And when they're questioned, they say, we can't let that idiot win. And so we have to go fast and win. And everyone's saying, but hang on, shouldn't we all slow down? And the answer is, no, you don't understand. If we don't go fast, the terrible. I think the last 20 years of my business life has been characterized by people saying, we've had enough of talking. We never agree anything. Go, go, go. It's all about speed. And now it feels like what you're implying, and again, I would love to believe this is true, is that people are going, actually, we'd have to go slowly, but maybe we need something sustainable and long-term, and maybe thinking about some of this stuff has value.
Yeah, and your word sustainable is a word that a lot of organisations are using now. So everyone's looking at sustainable practice. And so if we want to be sustainable, look at that across your organisation in terms of what we're doing, is our practice sustainable? And when then people shine a spotlight on what's going on, like actually people are, you can't just keep pushing people to go faster and faster and loading more and more on people, expect them just to cope. And actually, by the way, we're missing the point because we're just putting more and more on. It's getting more and more complicated. We need to stop and question, what are we actually about? How do we want to show up? What do we need to achieve? And are we doing it in the best way? And going right back to basics. But that takes, and I think that, so as a leader, in terms of sort of charisma and competence and so on, having a mission, actually having courage to sort of challenge the status quo, be different, and say, we are not going to be running to the finish line as quickly as possible because we are going to be known for quality, for making sure that we are sustainable, for making sure that, you know, we are doing things the best possible way. We're not just doing it to tick a box and run as fast as we can. And I think that people are more, they feel more aligned with practice like that because everyone feels like there's the craving to slow down a bit. Yeah. I think we just have this, whoever we are, everything feels just too fast at the moment.
As we've been talking today, I've been wondering, we've talked about in the distance bad leadership, and I think in our minds we've got senses of what's bad leadership. Actually, have we benefited from bad leadership to make it easier to talk about what good leadership looks like? It's almost the fact that Viktor Orban says, you will do what I say, everyone, because I'm in charge. That allows people to say, hang on a minute, I'm a bit uncomfortable with that. Well, what is the alternative? What do I want that to be? Maybe we should thank bad leaders around the world for helping us.
But it's a prompt, isn't it? It's just like I don't talk to my kids about certain things about, you know, think about where you're going to sit on a bus if you're on your own, or think about who you're speaking to if you go out to the park on your own, until something happens, you're prompted as a reminder, like, oh gosh, actually I need to have that conversation again, because there has to be something. Our world is so full that for something to get to the top and for us to think, okay, we need to remember to talk about this or think about this, there's usually got to be some sort of stimulus.
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of things become sort of perceived wisdom as learned behaviours. And it's only when we're jolted back into reality to go, oh yeah, that's why we do these things, because when we don't, this is what happens. So I think it's those external stimulus that allows deeper conversations to happen. I think going back to the speed thing though, part of the current sort of zeitgeist, if you like, is getting after innovation. And I think, as we deal with complexity, one of the things we have to do is iterate through problems. And that's, that's the logic behind a very simplistic statement, move fast and break things. The challenge comes is to make it work, you have to learn. You have to learn from the mistakes. And to learn from your mistakes, you have to be going slow enough to receive the feedback, to analyse it, to reflect on it, and to make change.
It's not even too fast or too slow, it's the right speed. My experience has been, I kind of have a spidey sense when people say we don't have time or go faster. Because I found that's a remarkably convenient weapon to prevent people from probing. So it's almost, when I hear people going, you don't understand, we have to move fast, rather than going, oh my God, we have to move fast, I've been around on the planet long enough to go, well, that's interesting. Why is speed the most important thing all of a sudden? Hang on a minute. What is it that you don't want us to do or is inconvenient or you want to avoid? Because often it's, we don't need to do the safety things because we're going fast. Well, okay. Why do you not think we have to do the safety things? So I think there is this danger that there is something intoxicating about going faster.
I think also as leaders in organisations, perhaps this is more managers than leaders, they're the same people but it's different aspects. The sense of everybody being busy makes you feel like you're doing the right thing, and so there's a comfort in the discomfort that everybody else has, which is a really toxic thing, but I think it's alive and well. And it's this idea that if everybody's busy, then I'm doing my job correctly because they're all gainfully employed. And again, it comes back to, what are you measuring? Are you measuring output, productivity, growth, development, or are you measuring how many hours people clock, how many emails they send? And it depends what you're judging success on. And again, it's about incentives.
I think that's brilliant. I always ask people, so imagine you walk past your leader, if that's the team leader or the organisation leader, their office, and they're just sitting there at their desk, appearing just to stare into space or look out the window, not doing anything. What would you be thinking? And you usually are met with a whole series of like, well, God, they clearly haven't got enough to do, or why they're not cracking on with that. People aren't valuing space. And going back to your point about innovation, when people are under pressure, we become more transactional, we close down, we just lose the ability to innovate. And for businesses to keep progressing, keep evolving, we've got to keep doing new things. We've got to keep trying new things. And we become locked into patterns that are familiar. We just keep running over and over and over the same patterns, unless we've got time to sit back and just create space, just to reflect. And people go, I'm too busy for that stuff. But when people can recognize the value of that space, which goes back to us slowing down, to question that what we are doing is good, rather than, I could be running, really proud of myself for running to the end of the garden, but I could just run straight there, or I could do zigzag backwards and forwards because I haven't really planned it properly. That's really valuable.
As we say the words fast and slow, those are very emotive words that create emotions in people. For me, it's got to be about the right speed. There's times when it's run.
Yeah, for sure.
There's times when it's stop, recover, and there's something in between. I think it's the thoughtfulness and the purposefulness of that speed, which is why run fast and break things again makes me twitch, because are you saying in every single case we should run fast and break things?
And that's not sustainable.
And it's not sustainable. And breaking things, I mean, I've always worried about, is breaking things really what you want me to do? I didn't realise that was the corporate goal. I have two quick questions to finish with. We'll do this as, I was going to say quick fire, knowing us it won't be quick fire. And then a sort of a final wrap up of, do we believe that our sort of values and our views on leadership have really changed? Here's the first quick question. Is empathy actually a leadership strength, or has it become a liability in high stakes environments? It's almost a cheat, because I think we've touched on areas around this, but less empathy? Is it a bit of a waste of our time?
I think there's, again, clarity about what empathy is.
Yeah.
I think there's a real confusion about people thinking empathy means being liked. And it means we avoid challenging conversations, and we avoid making decisions that need to be made. and we've all got to like each other, and that's not a good place to
That's
be.
really, and that's not necessarily my definition of empathy, but I can completely see empathy means being nice to people, which is not what empathy means.
No.
I mean, I think empathy is about caring enough to think, how are you thinking and feeling? Partly because I don't want you to be unhappy, but actually because if I understand how you are thinking and feeling, it allows me to be the most effective in doing what I want to do.
Yeah.
You are not in a good place to help me. I will find someone who's in a good place. You are in a good place. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
I see empathy as a tool
It's a
for
tool.
success,
I think that's exactly it.
as opposed to something about how people are feeling.
There is no right.
Spitting that in a bad way.
There is no right answer to that question. There isn't, is there not enough empathy or too much empathy? Because again, it's context driven. It's a tool. Empathy is a really important human trait for building connections, for understanding, and trust are two of the critical things that you need to make better decisions. But if you spend all your time trying to empathize with your people and understand everything about them, and you're not ever getting to a point where you're being decisive, then you're not being an effective leader. Vice versa. If you are just making decisions and not taking into account how other people are responding to those, how it's going to affect them, you're also not being an effective leader.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's a thing to be used and balanced based on the context of
I
the
really
decision.
like these ideas, that many of these behaviors or ideas that many people are very uncomfortable about because of this hippie nature. It's none of that. These are literally all tools for a good leader.
Yeah.
If you say reporting, no one's going to say, reporting's hippie. They go, I understand you need feedback on how you're behaving. And I think some of these other ideas like empathy or DEI are no different. These are tools that I, as a leader, if I employ them successfully, I will beat other people who are not employing these.
And can I just say that I think the language is important. So if you're wanting to talk about the good that can come from empathy as a tool, but you're talking to a leader who doesn't get empathy, then use a different word and describe what it is that you are trying to achieve, why it's important. So you use the language that resonates with people rather than fixed terms that people switch off to.
That's a really well said. We forget that everyone has a different lens which they see these things through. Last question, and we skipped through the empathy one because again, in a sense, it's cheating. I know how we all feel about this. This one, actually, I do want us to slow down a little bit more on. Has modern leadership overcorrected prioritizing psychological safety and inclusivity at the expense of performance and resilience? And I'll go first. Possibly. And I'm very, very careful about this. I believe deeply in psychological safety. I believe inclusivity is another one of these tools. So I do believe in them passionately, but I can absolutely recognize that you can take those tools and overcorrect for them at the expense of both performance, but resilience is another one of those things. I don't want you to feel sad, and so we can't have a difficult conversation.
Exactly.
If that makes sense.
That makes absolute sense. Yeah, I agree. I think there are definitely circumstances where there are organisations that have overcorrected, and they are doing exactly that. They're avoiding difficult conversations because they feel like it enters the danger zone of people feeling sad or bitter or angry. And sometimes that is just the natural, friction of working in a complex environment. I think the thing that, for me, makes psychological safety so powerful is the ability to learn as an organisation, to learn as a group. If you are dealing with a subject that doesn't require a huge amount of learning, then actually psychological safety becomes something that you can dial down and is less important. If you are talking about complicated things, these are things where the feedback loops can be very easily understood through analysis, and then you can put mechanisms in place, then you don't need psychological safety. you need checklists, you need rehearsals, you need really, really clear limits of authority so that people know where they fit in the organisation and what decisions they get to make and what they don't. If you're dealing with complexity and you're learning collectively as the organisation to come through this stronger, innovation being a really, really good example of that, then you need lots of psychological safety because nobody has the right answers, whether it's the boss or the new intern. And so you need that trust, you need that ability to learn through making mistakes, you need that ability to share that information. So I think it's a balance. And yeah, I think there are definitely sort of zeitgeisty kind of feelings that psychological safety is the answer to all our complicated problems. And it often has been used in the wrong way.
Goddamn hippies. Sorry, I got carried away for a second. Lisa, this is a big thing we talked about last time we spoke to you.
It goes back as a common theme today to defining it, and so for teams to explore what they need to feel psychologically safe from their leaders and managers, and for leaders and managers to engage in that conversation. But then for leaders to also be able to explain how psychological safety fits with challenging conversations, decision-making, accountability, all the stuff that some leaders worry we can't engage with if we're being nice to people. So actually tying it all together and being very clear, Radical Candor is a great model for, we want to have challenging conversations. We want to show care. I care about you as an individual, but I'm also going to tell you what I need to say to you. That is a really good framework for having a sensitive, caring conversation, but doing it in an appropriate way. You have to you can't, psychological safety doesn't stand alone. No. Otherwise there's a risk of you either do that or you do the proper business stuff. You've got to do psychological safety so that it enables all the other business stuff to happen.
Yeah, I think there's a really great example of that, which is the health and safety, or safety really, culture within the aerospace industry, where the application of safety procedures is really, really strict. These are checklists that have to be applied. There are alcohol limits that aircrew and pilots have to abide by. There are sleep mandated rest periods and sleep periods. These are not debatable. These are fixed rules. When things go wrong, when near misses happen, accidents happen, rules get broken because life and friction, the radical candor of being able to say, this went wrong and we need to report it, and I'm going to be really honest with you about why this went wrong, is how the organisation learns and then changes those fixed rules or adapts those fixed rules. And that's where those two systems work symbiotically to be really, really effective. And it's why the aerospace industry and commercial airlines are some of the technically most complicated machine systems that as humanity we operate, and yet it is one of the safest industries out there.
So we're coming to the end, and the whole premise of this episode was, have the core tenets and values and principles of leadership changed? I'll kick off, but I want to go around the table and see what you think. First, and almost obviously for me, I don't think they have. I think the principles of good leadership are the principles of good leadership. Context changes. But the other thing that really, really struck me through this conversation, each of these principles of leadership should be considered as tools. And that immediately starts to talk about certain things. You have to have terms of reference for these tools. So we've talked about almost in every situation, what do you mean by success? What are your terms of reference? Once you understand that, it allows you to dial up and dial down. It allows you to describe what you're doing and why you're doing it. The other thing as well, which this is something I, again, personally feel very passionate about and is not popular, is it turns out talking about this stuff is really valuable. Multiple times in this conversation today, I mean, literally for an hour, we have talked about the theory of this. And in each case, we have almost said, well, hang on a minute. What do you mean by that? Well, I mean this. Oh, no, I mean this. It feels like that idea of discussing it across an organization, across a populace. What do you mean by success? Wouldn't that be absolutely fascinating if we put all of our political leaders for an hour without them being badgered and say, we want you to tell us in detail what you mean by success, what you think your principles are? That I think that would radically change how some people see our politicians. We don't do this. And I think it goes back to this idea of speed. We're always talking. Oh, we need to be getting on with stuff. And specialists, Formula One drivers, I'm trying to find a different analogy to what you've used, are experts at what they do. And every single part of the car is tuned to excess. The idea that how can you care about tyres? Come on, we should just get in the car and go. No, tyres really matter. The temperature, how they're set up, the engine, the driver. Each of these things merits deep thought, deep discussion and expertise. And I think maybe this sort of finishes me off for today is, why is it that we don't treat leadership in this same way? All too often we poke at different bits of leadership, often in an all too shallow way. If this conversation has said anything, is this is really bloody difficult to do well. You have to invest the time and effort. But if you do, you will look like the proverbial swan who is gliding across the pond, but is paddling underneath. And the great leaders, we do a series on influencers and we talk about many of the greatest leaders. I think people assume, well, they just know how to be great leaders. And I think some people are lucky, they instinctively know. But I think there's lots of people that spent a lot of time and effort thinking about what it meant to be a great leader. We just did Shackleton. He spent a lot of time working out, how do I be a really effective leader? And so we should treat this in a way we would treat many other disciplines, and I fear we don't.
I think a lot of the people that we look at as great leaders haven't necessarily read all the books and then sat around and discussed it, but they've done it through practice. But they are people who have reflected on their practice and evolved and thought about and learned from their mistakes. So I don't think you necessarily have to be a SWAT who reads all the leadership books. In fact, I think a lot of the time that's a really unhelpful thing to do. But being reflective and working out how you did things, what worked well, what didn't work, and how you would change things going forward is how we develop and grow in, and master any art. And
I'll add one, and being curious.
And it is an art, not a science.
Yeah.
And we keep coming back to this. It's bloody complicated. It's always context driven. There's no right and wrong answers. It's an art. It's about finding that balance of all these different factors at the time, in the right moment, based on the information you currently have, with the relationships you are given and that you've created and cultivated, and the trust that you have in the bank, dealing with a situation and then going forward and developing.
Typical hippie cop-out, that's all I can say. Lisa, what's your final thoughts on this?
Well, I agree with what both of you said completely. I think being a leader is actually incredibly hard if you care as a leader. It's very public. Everyone has a view on whether you're doing it well or not. And you can't kind of hide under the radar. I think that time to dedicate to what is leadership about, what do we mean by leadership, what's good leadership look like, and then think about how we do that across the organisation with all the leaders, because you can have, whoever's at the top, they've got to be very clear, but then you'll have different variations of that, different interpretations of that. And you've got to have alignment on leadership teams if you want your organisation to work well. And you might have however many different individuals with their own charismatic style and their own sense of where we're going. So that time, not only for an individual leader, but as a team collectively, is super important.
Well, look, Gareth and Lisa, thank you very, very much. I've really, really, really enjoyed the conversation. For the moment, though, I think that probably finishes us for this week, and it leaves us to say the normal things. If you have found what we have talked about interesting, and you have not subscribed, then please do subscribe. Likewise, we can be found at battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com. We are on Twitter and Blue Sky on Battling with Biz with AZ. We really would love to hear from you if you've got any more ideas of topics we should cover. I think we've just been talking about in the break about how we think definitely talk about radical candor, just because it makes me nervous, the phrase radical candor. And so therefore I need to know more about it to be better at it, not feel worried. As we also say, we love recording this podcast. We love talking to our guests. Honestly, if a tree falls down in the woods, does anyone hear it? Or does a one-handed man clap on it? All that kind of nonsense. It doesn't matter whether you've listened to this or not. What really matters is, are you actually having these conversations with other people where you work, whether your friends, your kids, your boss, the people that work for you, the people that work with you? The thing that makes this valuable for myself, I think I speak for Lisa and Gareth, is we're constantly learning. Go on this journey yourself if you're not. Please have these conversations with other people, because as we've said, I think multiple times, and even more so at this current moment in time, is we need good leaders. Whatever you believe in, whatever you're trying to achieve, we need good leaders. On that dramatic, tree-hugging, hippie note, we need good leaders. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Lisa, particularly for joining us.
Pleasure.
And putting up with our ranting and car spotting. And we'll see you next time on Battling with Business.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Cheerio.
If you enjoyed listening to this conversation, there are 3 things I invite you to do. First, click the link in the show notes to download the resources for this episode. Secondly, help me extend the reach of this podcast by leaving a quick review on Apple or wherever you listen. And please share this episode with your colleagues so that you can discuss what resonates for your team. And finally, as usual, I invite you to reach out to me on LinkedIn or through my website so we can keep the conversation flowing. I know listeners often say they're keen to implement some of the key takeaways, but find it tough without guidance or extra support. If that's you, drop me a line and let's chat. Be sure to check out itstimeforchange.co.uk, where you'll find a whole heap more to support you to reflect on and develop your own practice. And while you're there, join the Leadership Lens to stay up to date with bespoke support services like my retained partnerships, where I'm by your side through all things leadership, culture, and performance. Feel free to reach out if you want to know more. I'm a great sounding board for challenges and ideas for development, so grab all the details you need from the show notes. I'm really looking forward to hearing from you and to welcoming you to my next episode coming soon. Join me then.